It began not with glory, but with necessity. By the early 1960s, the war in Vietnam was no longer just a conflict of ideology. It was becoming a laboratory of modern warfare. Dense jungles, unforgiving humidity, and a determined enemy made traditional strategies almost obsolete. The U.S. military needed a way to move fast, strike hard, and survive the ambushes that seemed to materialize from the trees themselves. The answer came in the form of a machine. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois, nicknamed the Huey, became the beating heart of America's air mobility revolution. But as these helicopters began flying deeper into hostile territory, they quickly turned into flying targets. Viet Cong ambushes, machine gun fire, and RPGs from unseen tree lines tore through aluminum skin and rotor blades. To defend themselves, the crews needed firepower and courage, and thus the door gunner was born. At first, they weren't even officially recognized roles. Many were volunteers from infantry units, men who had grown tired of trudging through mud and blood, who craved the speed and danger of flight. Others were crew chiefs who doubled as gunners when the mission demanded it. They leaned out of open helicopter doors, their hands gripping M60 machine guns, firing into the jungle at shadows, muzzle flashes, or the faintest sign of movement. They had no armor, no cover, only a steel bird between them and death. A typical mission for a door gunner wasn't scripted like the war movies that would come later. It was chaos wrapped in noise. The deafening whine of the rotors, the vibration of the airframe, the smell of hot oil and gunpowder, and the constant threat that at any moment a tracer round could punch through the cockpit glass or rip through their body. For the door gunners of Vietnam, survival wasn't just skill, it was instinct. They learned to read the terrain like language. They could spot muzzle flashes faster than the eye could process. They developed reflexes honed by terror, a twitch meant to save a life. One gunner described it best: "You never fired at a person. You fired at where the jungle moved, because by the time you saw the enemy, you were already too late." But behind the adrenaline and thunder was a quieter truth. Door gunners carried an emotional burden heavier than their ammunition belts. Each mission brought a mix of fear and exhilaration, and when they landed, the silence hit harder than the gunfire. They had seen villages burned, friends shot out of the sky, and enemies they couldn't even name. Unlike infantrymen who could dig in, door gunners were always in motion, always between life and death, never on solid ground. By 1966, door gunners had become a symbol, not of strategy, but of raw courage. The 1st Cavalry Division and 101st Airborne relied on them daily. Hueys carried supplies, evacuated wounded men, dropped troops into landing zones blazing with gunfire. And each time, the door gunner stood, not behind armor, but behind trust. They trusted their pilots, their crew chief, their gun. The M60 became more than a weapon. It was their lifeline. They named them Baby, Sally, Ma Deuce's little sister. They cleaned them religiously, knowing a jammed weapon meant death in midair. And yet, even among this fraternity of flyers, there was an unspoken understanding. Door gunners weren't supposed to live long. Statistically, their odds were among the worst in the war. Helicopters were the most targeted assets in Vietnam, and a gunner, exposed at the side, was often the first to die. Still, they kept volunteering. Why? Because for many, it was better to die flying than crawling. That was the paradox of the door gunner. They were both hunter and hunted, the edge of modern warfare, and the last line of defense for every man on board. By late 1967, as the Tet Offensive loomed, their importance would reach its peak. The skies over Vietnam were no longer empty. They were crowded with Hueys, Chat, and gunships, all guarded by the watchful eyes of men behind the doors. And soon, they would face their greatest test. By the dawn of 1968, Vietnam's skies were filled with the sound of rotor blades, a metallic heartbeat pulsing above the green inferno. The war had evolved. What began as small-scale advisory missions had exploded into one of the most helicopter-dependent conflicts in human history. Helicopters became not just tools of transport, but the very symbol of the war itself. For every soldier on the ground, the sound of a Huey meant hope, supplies, evacuation, salvation. For the enemy, it meant death from above. And for the men on board, especially the door gunners, it meant gambling with fate every single flight. The Tet Offensive would test everything. In January 1968, as North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces unleashed a coordinated surprise attack across South Vietnam, the U.S. military scrambled to respond. Cities like Hue, Saigon, and Khe Sanh erupted in chaos. Helicopters became lifelines, ferrying troops, ammunition, and the wounded between battle zones. Door gunners had no rest. Their shifts blurred into one long mission. Fuel up, fly, drop, extract, reload, return. Over and over. Each landing zone, LZ in military terms, was a death trap. Viet Cong gunners knew exactly where Hueys would descend. They waited in silence, their DSK heavy machine guns camouflaged among the palms, until the sound of incoming rotors gave them away. And as the choppers hovered for mere seconds, the jungle exploded with gunfire. In those moments, door gunners became the shield between life and annihilation. They didn't think, they reacted, their instincts forged from months of combat. They sprayed bursts of 7.62 millimeter fire into tree lines, muzzle flashes lighting up their faces. Brass casings rained down onto the floor, sometimes burning through fatigues. Many described it as being inside a storm made of fire. The entire world shook. Every sense was drowned in vibration. Gunfire, engines, screams, the smell of cordite and blood. And yet, somehow, they functioned. They spoke in short, precise bursts. Left side clear. Taking fire. 9 o'clock. Pilot hit. I've got him. No one had time for fear. At Khe Sanh, one of the war's most brutal sieges, door gunners flew hundreds of missions under relentless artillery fire. One crew chief recalled that out of the 12 Hueys in his unit, only 4 survived the month intact. Most were shredded by shrapnel or simply never came back. A gunner named Tom Tex Harkins remembered hovering over the base as it burned below. "You didn't think about getting hit," he said later. "You thought about keeping that gun going. Because if you stopped, someone on the ground was gonna die." Their courage was mechanical, their duty relentless. But courage came with cost. By mid-1968, the casualty rate for helicopter crews had surpassed that of nearly any other role in the U.S. military. The life expectancy of a door gunner in active zones like the Central Highlands was measured in weeks, not months. Still, replacements kept coming. Some volunteered. Others were simply assigned. Young men, barely out of high school, stepping into machines older than they were. The veterans taught them quickly. Keep your eyes moving. Don't fix on one point. That's how you miss the muzzle flash. If you hear metal pinging, you're being hit. If you don't, you're just lucky. Never stop firing unless you have to. The cockpit and gun doors became a strange kind of classroom, a mix of adrenaline, mentorship, and survival. Over time, these men developed an unbreakable bond.
Pilots trusted their door gunners like brothers.
A good gunner could save the entire aircraft by spotting ambushes before they happened, or cutting down an RPG team seconds before launch. And the gunner, in turn, trusted the pilot with his life, literally. If a chopper went down, rescue was uncertain. The enemy targeted crash sites relentlessly. Door gunners often used their own N60s to cover survivors until rescue birds arrived, if they arrived at all. There were countless acts of valor that never made the headlines. A gunner who stayed behind to hold off enemy troops while his wounded crew was airlifted out. Another who continued firing even after taking a round through his shoulder, using his other arm to keep the M60 running. Some were awarded medals. Most received nothing but silence. By 1969, helicopter tactics had evolved. The Army introduced gunships like the UH-1 Cobra, designed to provide dedicated fire support. Sleek, deadly, and fast. But even as these attack helicopters entered service, Hueys remained the backbone of the war. They carried troops, ammo, supplies, and dreams, all guarded by those same exposed men behind the doors. And with each passing month, the psychological weight grew heavier. Door gunners rarely talked about their fear, but it lived inside them. The roar of engines haunted their sleep. The smell of oil and smoke lingered on their clothes long after returning home. Many developed what we'd now call PTSD, though back then it had no name. They called it the shakes or the 1,000-yard stare.
For every mission that went right, there were others that ended in smoke and wreckage. Hueys burning in the elephant grass, crews trapped inside, rescue birds circling helplessly above. Yet they never stopped flying, never stopped volunteering. They weren't fighting for politics or medals. They were fighting for each other, for the men sitting beside them, for the soldiers on the ground waving frantically for pickup, for the unspoken promise that no one would be left behind. And through it all, the door gunner remained the uncredited hero of a war that blurred courage and chaos into one unending flight. Soft, reflective tone shift. I remember the faces of the men we lifted out. Some were crying, some were smiling, some were already gone. And every time I told myself, if I can bring one more back alive, it's worth it. As 1970 approached, the U.S. military began to withdraw and the skies grew quieter. But for the door gunners, the silence was almost unbearable. After years of constant action, they returned home to indifference and sometimes hostility. The noise stopped, but the echoes never did. When the last American helicopters lifted off from the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in April 1975, their blades beating against the gray morning air, it marked not just the end of a war, but the end of an era. For over a decade, the whine of turbines and the thunder of rotors had defined Vietnam. They had become as much a part of its landscape as the rice paddies, jungles, and monsoon clouds. But for the men who had lived behind those open doors, who had gripped the M60s until their fingers went numb, the silence that followed was deafening. When they came home, there were no parades, no flags waving, no brass bands playing victory songs. Instead, there was confusion, resentment, and for many, a strange kind of shame, not because of what they had done, but because of how the world chose to see them. Door gunners were often invisible in the historical record, their heroism swallowed by the political debates that consumed the war's aftermath. They weren't generals or strategists or policymakers. They were ordinary men placed in extraordinary situations, young, scared, determined, and often forgotten. Some tried to move on. They went back to school, started families, took jobs. But even decades later, the sound of a helicopter passing overhead could stop them cold. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. The smell of diesel, the sudden drop of altitude, the weight of the gun in their hands. It was all still there, waiting beneath the surface. One veteran recalled how, years later, while working construction, the whir of a cement mixer sent him diving for cover. Another said he couldn't sit with his back to a door, not after so many flights where every opening meant exposure. For them, the war had never really ended. It simply changed shape. And yet, in their silence, they carried something profound: duty without expectation. These men didn't seek medals, they sought meaning. And in their way, they found it, not in glory, but in the lives they saved. Because for every Huey that went down, dozens made it home. For every mission that ended in chaos, there were hundreds where wounded soldiers reached safety, because someone on that chopper refused to stop firing. A door gunner's trigger finger often meant the difference between a flag on a coffin and a soldier coming home. As time passed, historians began to look closer. They realized that the door gunner's war had shaped modern combat more than anyone understood. The tactics, the teamwork, the ability to insert and extract troops under fire. All of it became the foundation of modern air assault doctrine. From the sands of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, soldiers today still fly into battle on helicopters, often carrying echoes of the Vietnam gunners' lessons. When the Black Hawk pilots of Mogadishu fought for survival in 1993, they used the very same radio calls, the same formations, and the same spirit. When medevac crews risked their lives in the deserts of the Middle East, they followed the unspoken code born decades earlier in Southeast Asia: never leave a man behind. By the 1980s, Vietnam veterans began gathering again, at reunions, at airfields, at small memorials scattered across the country. Old pilots found their crew chiefs. Door gunners met the men they had once covered from the sky. And in those moments, decades of silence broke. The stories came pouring out of missions over Ia Drang, Dak To, Pleiku, Khe Sanh, of helicopters that barely made it home on one engine, of friends who never came back. For the first time, they realized that their story mattered, not as statistics, but as testament. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was unveiled in Washington, D.C., a black granite wall reflecting both sky and sorrow. It held over 58,000 names, each one carved in stone. Many door gunners came to touch those names and saw, reflected beside them, their own faces grown older, lined by time and memory. Some wept quietly. Others stood in silence, their hands tracing the letters of brothers lost in the air. One veteran wrote later, "We thought we'd been forgotten, but when I saw that wall, I realized we hadn't vanished. We were just waiting for the world to listen." And today, the world is listening. The door gunner is no longer an anonymous silhouette in old war footage. He is remembered as the embodiment of courage under fire, of loyalty without question, of calm in chaos. Museums now display their helmets, flak vests, and M60s, artifacts not of destruction, but of survival. Filmmakers and historians study their missions to understand how human endurance adapts when trapped between fear and duty.
Each new generation of pilots and gunners learns about the men who came before them, who taught the world that bravery is not loud, it's steady. It's the sound of a gunner whispering into the intercom, "We're clear, bring them home," even now. When aging veterans gather at air shows, the sight of a restored UH-1 Huey draws them in. They run their hands along the metal, faded olive paint still smelling faintly of oil. They climb inside, sit where they once sat, and close their eyes. In that moment, the years fall away. They can still hear the rotors, still feel the vibration in their chest, still see the endless green jungle stretching beneath them. And for a brief heartbeat, they are back in the war, not out of nostalgia, but out of connection. Connection to those who never came back. Connection to the men they saved. Connection to a time when their world was chaos, but their purpose was clear. That purpose remains, not in the sound of war, but in the silence of remembrance. Because remembrance is its own kind of victory, one that no enemy can take away. So when the next helicopter lifts off, in training, in combat, in rescue, it carries more than soldiers. It carries history. It carries legacy. It carries the spirit of every door gunner who ever braved the fire to save another life. And so, as the blades fade into the distance, remember this. The story of the Vietnam door gunners isn't just a chapter in history. It's a reminder of what courage truly means. They didn't fight for medals or fame or politics. They fought for each other, for duty, for survival, for the promise that no man would be left behind. If stories like this move you, if you believe these voices from history deserve to be remembered, subscribe now and stay with us, because every week, we uncover another untold story from the pages of war, of courage, sacrifice, and the cost of freedom. Watch the next documentary, where we'll reveal the forgotten operation that changed the fate of the Pacific War. Click now and keep history alive.